Myriad modifications and refinements of field artillery's World War II organizations, weapons, and techniques became the norm during the post-war years up to the advent of the missile age in the mid-1950s. During a 2-week artillery conference of Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and foreign military representatives held at U.S. Army Field Artillery School in March 1946. The conferees recommended that the number of medium artillery battalions in both the infantry and armored divisions be increased, that the strength of all 105 mm howitzer batteries be raised from 4 to 6 howitzers, that a third battery be added to the observation battalion, that the number of forward observers be increased in all battalions, and that field artillery, anti-aircraft artillery, and coast artillery be consolidated into a single arm. They also proposed that short-range counter-mortar radar detachments be made organic to divisions, that self-propelled weapons be provided to all field artillery units except PAC and airborne organizations, and that the development of missiles be encouraged. Many of these recommendations became reality by the end of the decade. The Army published new tables of organization and equipment for the infantry and armored divisions in 1948. The howitzers in the infantry division were truck-drawn. The tables confirmed the rank of the infantry division artillery commander as brigadier general. The 1948 tables authorized each 105 mm howitzer battery 3 forward observer sections, 1 for each supported maneuver company, and each 105 mm howitzer battalion 4 liaison officers. Each 155 mm howitzer battalion was authorized 2 forward observers in the headquarters battery and 1 liaison officer. The new structure of both the armored and infantry division artillery resembled the infantry division artillery of World War II, except that an anti-aircraft automatic weapons battalion was added and each infantry division artillery firing battery was increased by 2 howitzers. The number of field pieces in infantry divisions totaled 72, consisting of 54 105 mm howitzers and 18 155 mm howitzers. The authorized strength of the infantry division artillery stood at 3,688. The authorized aggregate strengths of the infantry division artillery were decreased by 1952, reducing to 3,541. Although the artillery firepower remained unchanged. Post-war changes in non-divisional artillery also included the addition of considerable firepower. The major change in the 105 mm and 155 mm howitzer battalions, their reorganization with 6-gun batteries like those in the infantry division artillery units, added 50% more firepower to each battery. The non-divisional 105 mm howitzer battalions had fewer forward observers than did their divisional counterparts, and they had no counter-mortar radar sections, these elements being available from Corps or Army levels. Each battalion was authorized a medical detachment, while the divisional battalions pulled theirs into a single division artillery medical detachment. During World War II, the Corps observation battalions consisted of a headquarters and 2 observation batteries. New tables published in 1948 authorized a 3rd observation battery. Also provided were a counter-mortar radar platoon in each observation battery and additional personnel and equipment for a survey information section, a meteorological section, and a topographical platoon in the headquarters battery. In 1952, field artillery took over the function of battlefield illumination from the engineers. Thereafter, 1 field artillery searchlight battery was allotted to each corps and given the mission of furnishing indirect and direct illumination in support of night operations. Each battery was authorized 3 platoons and a total of 18 searchlights. A platoon comprised 6 sections, each equipped with a searchlight, and was capable of providing battlefield illumination for a division. Major reorganizations in the non-divisional artillery command structure were recommended, but they were never implemented. Peacetime cuts in defense spending and strength ceilings were the primary causes of deficiencies in post-war Army organizations. Of the 10 regular Army divisions active at the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, only one was at full strength. The others averaged about 70% of their authorized strengths. All had major shortages in equipment. Of the 59 active field artillery battalions in the regular Army, about 2/3 were divisional units. Most of the 105mm howitzer battalions had only 2 active firing batteries instead of 3. In addition to the 20 non-divisional field artillery battalions, 1 Corps Artillery Headquarters and Headquarters Battery and 2 Field Artillery Group Headquarters were active. Heavy artillery was virtually non-existent. Jumping off on June 25, 1950, North Korean troops achieved surprise and substantial initial success. The slow U.S. intervention, coupled with the uncertainty regarding the intentions of the Soviet Union, and the vacillating stance of the United Nations, all served to dull the sharpness of the Western response. Task Force Smith, consisting of 24th Infantry Division elements, including the 52nd Field Artillery Battalion, entered the conflict from Japan on July 2. The remainder of the division, the 1st Cavalry Division, and the 25th Infantry Division soon followed. By August 13, all of the 1st Cavalry Divisions and the 25th Infantry Division's Field Artillery Battalions had arrived in Korea, as well as the 1st Non-Divisional 1, the 17th Field Artillery Battalion, armed with 8-inch howitzers. To help compensate for the 11 missing batteries in the 2 divisions committed, the 9th Field Artillery Battalion from the 3rd Infantry Division, the 92nd Armored Field Artillery Battalion from the 2nd Armored Division, the 555th Field Artillery Battalion with the 5th Regimental Combat Team in Hawaii, and the personnel and equipment of 2 batteries in the 14th Regimental Combat Team were ordered to Korea. Due to lacking non-divisional artillery, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of the Far East Command and newly appointed Commander of the United Nations Command in Korea, asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff on July 13 for 15 battalions, including 6 155mm howitzer battalions with self-propelled weapons. MacArthur projected a commitment of 4 Army divisions and 1 Provisional Marine Brigade in Korea. Because of wide frontages, broken terrain, and lack of adequate roads, he believed that the division commanders would employ their units by regimental combat teams and expected that at least 10 regiments would be on the front lines at the same time, having only 4 155mm howitzer battalions among the divisions. He wanted 6 more so that each regiment could have a medium artillery battalion when operating as a regimental combat team. For general support, MacArthur requested 8-inch howitzer and 155mm gun battalions, as well as more 105mm howitzer battalions to reinforce the divisional artillery and to support South Korean units, which were decidedly weak in field artillery. In June 1950, the artillery in the Republic of Korea Army consisted of only 91 105mm howitzers. However, there was too little artillery in the Army to meet all of General MacArthur's requests. 11 of the 20 active non-divisional field artillery battalions were in the United States, and all were under strength. The Department of the Army, therefore, ordered only 5 of MacArthur's 15 requested battalions to the front, 3 155mm howitzer battalions and the 1 8-inch howitzer and 1 observation battalion active in the entire regular Army. For control, the 5th Field Artillery Group was sent. By July 1951, General MacArthur had 41 field artillery battalions in Korea. Even so, General Matthew B. Ridgway, who succeeded MacArthur in April, wanted still more artillery because a year of battle had shown the enemy to be particularly susceptible to massed artillery fire. Heavy combat losses early in the war increased the Army's inherent personnel and equipment shortages. To alleviate the manpower problem, the Army arranged to use Korean nationals in American units under the Korean Augmentation to the United States Army program, which began in mid-1950. Although cultural differences, language barriers, and lack of training and familiarity with American weapons, organization, and techniques were problems, the KATUSAs enabled the Army to conduct 24-hour operations by furnishing additional manpower for the many non-technical aspects of firing. The program created a continuity of experience that would not have been possible under the personnel system adopted in 1951, permitted nearly normal operations when the units were seriously under strength, and eventually provided cadres for ROK artillery units. A call-up of the reserve components into active service furnished yet another source of manpower. The majority of units called up from the Army Reserve and Army National Guard replaced units in the United States that had been deployed overseas or went to Europe. Units sent to Korea included 2 infantry divisions from the National Guard, the 40th and 45th, each having the usual 4 field artillery battalions. By the end of the war, 33 non-divisional field artillery battalions had been called into federal service from the National Guard, of which 12 saw action in Korea. Most of the field artillery support from the Army Reserve came from individuals rather than from units, but 13 reserve battalions were placed on active duty, 2 of which served in Korea. Field artillery weapons used in Korea included the standard calibers, with the weapons of the divisional light and medium battalions furnishing most of the fire against personnel and the core artillery weapons concentrating primarily on materiel targets. The speed, flexibility, and volume of 105mm howitzer fire were extremely important in halting massed enemy attacks. The 155mm howitzer, the most versatile weapon, could also deliver effective volume fire, and its range accuracy and increased projectile weight fitted it for many destruction missions not requiring a heavier caliber or longer range. The 155mm gun was the least popular and least versatile field artillery piece used in Korea. Its longer range, however, somewhat compensated for its relative inaccuracies. It was an excellent field piece for use in forcing back or pushing underground enemy supply points, bivouacs, and command posts, which otherwise would have operated more freely above ground and closer to the front. The use of the proximity fuse, introduced in World War II, increased the effectiveness of the 155mm gun, as it also strengthened the effectiveness of the other field pieces. Although the 8-inch howitzer could destroy or neutralize most fortified artillery positions, the exceptions were sufficient reason to convert 2 battalions to 240mm howitzer units, the 240mm howitzer having a heavier and more powerful projectile. The 8-inch howitzer was a particularly good weapon for observed counter-battery fire and was used extensively against enemy strongpoints. The 240mm howitzer was employed only during the last 3 months of the war, but it lived up to expectations through its ability to destroy or neutralize strong bunkers and cave-type emplacements. There was a question, however, as to whether it was economical to use such expensive equipment when it could deliver only 90 rounds per day. Throughout the war, a major weakness of the 8th Army Artillery was an insufficient number of non-divisional artillery units. The 150-mile 5-corps front that existed in Korea during the last 2 years of the war could have justified between 50 and 60 corps artillery battalions, using the ratios of the European theater during World War II. Instead, by June 1953, there were only 20 non-divisional field artillery battalions in all of Korea. The lack of field artillery groups resulted in corps artillery battalions being controlled directly by the corps artillery headquarters in addition to their usual duties. Efforts made in the spring of 1951 to obtain 6 more group headquarters failed because of stringent troop ceilings. Yet, although the Corps artillery battalions received less than normal control and supervision, the lack of group headquarters posed no serious problem as long as the tactical situation remained stable. 8th Army felt the shortage briefly, however, when mobile warfare returned to the battlefield just before the armistice. During the war, the 5th Field Artillery Group, the only one in Korea, acted as a Corps artillery headquarters for the ROK 2nd Corps. It also controlled ROK field artillery groups being trained as division artillery headquarters. Although the makeshift arrangement was satisfactory in static periods, the group lacked the necessary personnel and communications equipment needed to control the up to 19 battalions under its supervision during fluid tactical situations. During the final 2 years of the war, deployment of Corps artillery battalions was based on the width of the front, the most likely avenues of enemy approach, and the estimated amount of artillery opposing each corps. The ROK 1st Corps, operating in a comparatively inactive sector on the East Coast, had no attached field artillery battalions but depended on naval gunfire support furnished by the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet. The ROK 2nd Corps had 3 U.S. field artillery battalions attached, 2 105mm howitzer armored battalions and 1 8-inch howitzer battalion. The remaining Corps artillery battalions were allotted to the U.S. Army 1st, 9th, and 10th Corps. Because there was never more than one 155mm gun battalion in a corps, the battalion was deployed by battery across the corps front. For most of the war, the same was true of the 8-inch howitzer battalions. Until January 1953, the 1st Field Artillery Observation Battalion, the only observation unit in Korea at the time, was deployed by battery, one each to the 3 American corps. Topographical and meteorological detachments reinforced the 2 batteries separated from their battalion headquarters. Later, when the 235th Field Artillery Observation Battalion arrived, the 1st and 9th Corps each received a battalion less 1 battery. The 2 detached batteries went to the 10th Corps and the ROK 2nd Corps. A 3rd Observation Battalion, scheduled to arrive in Korea in late August 1953, would have been adequate for the observation mission. Lack of trained artillery personnel, along with the need for additional battalions, continued to be a problem throughout the war. Although a liberal rotation policy adopted in early 1951 did much to raise morale among the troops, it adversely affected the performance of artillery units. Each month following initiation of the policy, there was an approximate 7.5% turnover of personnel in the field artillery units. Between October 1951 and July 1953, artillery personnel in the 8th Army were completely replaced almost 3 times. Proficiency was hard to maintain as a result, especially in the artillery. The U.S. artillery had lost its ability to shoot quickly and accurately because the rotation program had depleted the units of their veteran gunners. The replacement system simply was unable to supply enough trained specialists to fill the requirements, and the replacements that were furnished needed further training. Fortunately, because of the static nature of the war during the last 2 years, the replacement problem was not as severe as it might have been. The shortage of trained, experienced artillerymen was serious, but the shortage of artillery ammunition received far more attention. Even though adverse tactical and geographical conditions caused local shortages, total stocks in the Far East Command often fell below the full 90-day authorized level of supply and sometimes dropped below the safety level of 60 days. A chief cause of the ammunition shortage was a tremendous rise above what was considered normal rates of fire, which was, in turn, caused by the shortage of artillery pieces. Initially, the ammunition expenditure rate was based on experiences during World War II, but the reduced number of field artillery battalions per mile of front meant that each gun had to shoot more rounds than the expenditure tables allowed for achieving the required effectiveness. Soon after the war began, the Far East Command was allowed a temporary 3- to 6-fold increase in the so-called day of supply. The condition of the huge amounts of ammunition left over from World War II also contributed to the problem. At the end of the war, the United States had a tremendous stock of ammunition, but it was not a balanced one. Hasty demobilization depleted the army of personnel who could have assessed and cared for the ammunition, and as a result, much of it deteriorated. The army drew on the large stock without replacing it, and the lack of post-war orders caused the ammunition industry to close down. Prosperity in 1950 made the business community reluctant to reconvert factories to wartime needs, especially when many believed that the war would be short and that reconversions would not be necessary with the large World War II stockpiles available. Because an 18-month to 2-year lead time was necessary under the best of conditions to produce ammunition in quantity, ammunition was not supplied in adequate amounts until late 1952 and early 1953. By the spring of 1952, it was apparent that if ammunition were fired in Korea at the authorized rates, complete replacement would not be possible and theater levels would drop. Stocks, globally, were reaching critically low levels. The Far East Command, therefore, reduced the number of rounds a weapon could fire per day. Orders required that, wherever possible, air support and support from heavy artillery weapons, which were not as critically short of ammunition, be used instead of light and medium artillery. Nevertheless, in the event of an enemy attack, a gun could fire whatever amount was necessary to repulse it. The field artillery learned few new lessons during the war, but the importance of the arm was reconfirmed. Artillery played an important role in keeping the enemy confined to trenches and bunkers, and the large expenditures of ammunition made it possible for the United Nations command forces to compensate for being outnumbered and to keep their casualties low. Counter-battery, interdictory, and harassing fires pressured the communist forces continuously. The ability of the gunners to put down heavy fire quickly and accurately was an influential factor throughout the war. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Feel free to leave any questions or topics you'd like us to address in the comments below. Thank you for tuning in.